Welcome back. As you well know, Ben Franklin, he was never president, but he was present during some of the most important moments in our history. And that didn't just happen in his hometown of Philadelphia. He lived in London for decades. A new book called Benjamin Franklin in London chronicles that time, and we sat down with author George Goodwin. Well, I'm sure I'm not the first one to admit here, and I think most Americans, certainly when they think of Benjamin Franklin as time outside of the States, we first think of Paris and obviously dragging a reluctant king along here to help with both resources and guns here to be a critical element in terms of how the revolution turned out. But it turns out he spent more time in London, but formative years here, and I really didn't know that before the book. Have many people been surprised that it was 18 years, I guess, all told, that he spent in London, a big chunk of his life?
Well, Richard, it's a period that has been neglected. The problem is that often history is written backwards, and he's remembered, as you say, far more for the latter part from, if you like, from 1775 onwards. But the key thing was that for most of his life, 80% of his life, he regarded himself as British, and he wanted a great British Empire of North America. And it's thought that that he was a sort of a patriot revolutionary for some time. Not a bit of it. He tried his hardest to bring about an accommodation between Britain and the colonies, staying in Britain right up to March 1775.
And in fact, we'll talk about that in a minute, how he barely evaded arrest and put in the London Tower. But let's go to the second time and the largest chunk of time that he spent in London. He was around 50, right, George? And at that point, he was pretty celebrated in the States, both in terms of winning the equivalent of what was the Nobel Peace Prize, if you will, for his advances in electricity, and also as it relates to the Poor Richard's Almanac, which was very well read and known at the time. And he was celebrated when he came back to London, and he sure enjoyed how he was feted by the locals.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was one of the great scientific figures of the age. I mean, Immanuel Kant called him the Prometheus of modern times, and people such as David Hume celebrated him as the first great American man of letters. And there was a scientific craze in London amongst the aristocracy, men and women, particularly attracted, of course, to things that went bang with electricity. And he was welcomed with open arms amongst the aristocracy. And this actually gave him quite a degree of influence with the British aristocratic class as time went on.
It's funny, George, one of my children earlier this year had to do a project on Ben Franklin. They talked about what a sweet man he seemed to be, and I said, you know, when you're older, maybe you want to read up a little bit more, because Ben certainly liked to enjoy himself, not just, as you talk about, with a very fantastic appetite that isn't just relegated to the dinners he had. Isn't that right?
Yeah, well, he certainly did, but he was very cold to strangers, or could be cold to strangers, as his great friend Joseph Priestley said. You know, to strangers he was cold and reserved, but with those he was intimate. He was the most pleasant and friendly of companions.
You know, you talk about how it was really a late conversion. I mean, he was almost 70 by the time that he finally resolved, this isn't going to work here. You know, at the end, I've got to make my lot, and it's not going to be here in England. And he barely escaped arrest. But talk about the late progression of that, because he successfully got Parliament to back away, I guess, from the Stamp Act that turned into, I guess, the declaratory. Help me out here with the act here. That in the end,
the Declaratory Act, which
easy for you to
was
say, yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing about it was that Ben Franklin was the star witness in a committee of the whole House of Commons to get the Stamp Act repealed. But in order for the then government, the Rockingham government, to maintain their majority with backbenchers, they had to throw them a sop. And that was the Declaratory Act, which gave Parliament the right to tax Britain, but the deal was that they would never exercise it. And Franklin was actually quite relaxed about it, because he said, well, you have a Declaratory Act with Ireland which is not enforced, so this will not be a problem. Unfortunately, you could say it was a sort of unwritten agreement. But as Sam Goodwin said, unwritten or verbal agreements aren't worth the paper they're not written on. And the Declaratory Act was crossed, if you like, was ignored by Chancellor of Exchequer Townshend, who introduced the Townshend duties, and that was the beginning of if you like, the progression towards the break between Britain and America. But as far as Dr. Franklin was concerned, I like to think of him as a great chess grandmaster. He was incredibly keen on chess. And by the late 1760s, he almost had 4 tables in operation. One, it may surprise people, was he was still considering getting a job with the British government. And in fact, the Duke of Grafton, the then Prime Minister, and Lord North, his Chancellor in the late 1760s, kind of dangled a job in front of him. Franklin also had the idea of his own colony in what is now West Virginia, along the Ohio Valley. Of course, there was always the opportunity for him to go back to Pennsylvania, but things had actually not worked out too well with the dominant Penn family. And the fourth one was he actually started to see that there might be a breach between Britain and the colonies. So as well as being the political representative of Pennsylvania, the Assembly of Pennsylvania, which was the reason for him to come over, he also took on Georgia, New Jersey, and of course, Massachusetts.
George, how close did Franklin come to actually being arrested? I know a warrant was issued for him.
There was a warrant. It was actually a civil action because of the Hutchinson letters. These are letters that he leaked back to Boston, saying that Governor Thomas Hutchinson, he was actually, he was operating on his own. He didn't have the support of the British government, but please don't leak these letters. But of course they were leaked, and it was seen to be completely the opposite by the British government. And he was called to the Privy Council, and he arrived at the Privy Council just after the Boston Tea Party. The news reached London, and of course it became quite a bitter denunciation by the then Attorney General. However, even then, Franklin still was trying to bring about peace between Britain and the colonies. And for many, many months, he worked with William Pitt the Elder, the Earl of Chatham, who, was the great hero of the 7 Years' War, to come to an accommodation. But when Chatham actually presented it in February 1775, it was shouted down by the House of Lords, and then Franklin knew really that the game was up.
George, I'm curious. Obviously, we all think of Franklin as return to the States here and the pivotal role he helped play in the Revolution. But there was a sad postscript. He missed the death of his wife, who he'd been largely estranged with. She had suffered a stroke, and he didn't make it back in time. And I know in the book you talk about his son also holding bitterness towards his father for being absent, obviously during a critical point in the family's life.
Yes. It's very sad. They obviously were very close. I mean, they were close business partners. And that when he was over in London, effectively, wife Deborah looked after the shop. But he was divided really between his life in London and in Philadelphia. He created for himself effectively a new family in London. He lodged with Mrs. Stevenson. He was very close to her and her daughter Polly. I mean, I think it was sort of totally and utterly platonic. Those, previous historians have sort of gone for nudge, nudge, wink, wink, but I think it really was completely and utterly platonic. And Deborah really sort of faded out of his life. The letters between them became shorter and more matter of fact. And she hoped that he would come back to America. She could never join him because she had a fear of sea travel. But of course, his son, after she died, wrote to his father saying, "She gave up on the hope that you would actually get home this winter." That was the winter of 1774, and she died on Christmas Eve.
It's a fascinating read, and also about what has largely been, to this point, an unexamined chapter of Franklin's life, and also the motivations he had and how he viewed himself into later life. Again, the book, Benjamin Franklin in London, The British Life of America's Founding Father.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard.
And coming up next, in this election year, FDR's legacy is taking on special significance. We're going to talk about how the things he did then continue to resonate now.